Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for being here. So I'm Leo Migotti Ramponi. I'm a professor and a researcher at Paris Institut Français de la Mode, and I work primarily on music cognition. I have a PhD in cognitive science, and I'm very interested in the way music can evoke things, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about musical composition and generative artificial intelligence. So I just wanted to start with an example that probably a lot of you have heard about, which is an example from 3 to 4 years ago, with this project, Beethoven 10, the AI project that probably you have heard of, where a research team was trying to compose a hypothetical Beethoven's 10th symphony, which never existed, right? So the game was the following. The idea was to train the AI model on some sketches by Beethoven himself, also all of his compositions, as well as, and interestingly enough, some of his inspirations. So we know, for instance, for example, that Beethoven was highly inspired by the music of Haydn and Mozart, and that was also in the training data set. And so I just wanted to maybe give you a little feel of what that sounded like to start with. Hopefully the audios are gonna work, so let's try next. Okay. Okay, so that's Beethoven's 9th symphony, one that he actually wrote. And then we're gonna compare to the one AI generated based on his compositions. So, you know, you have something that's very like romantic, very bright, very shiny, very Beethoven-like. And the composition that AI created, hopefully we're gonna be able to listen to now. Oh, here it is, finally. So it was very short, but actually was very convincing. So you had like all the elements and all the ingredients that you would expect to find in an actual piece by Beethoven. Something that needs to be mentioned here is that the AI actually just generated the score and did not output the audio file. So the interpretation was still left to a conductor, an orchestra, and the performers in the orchestra, which is probably part of the reason why it was so convincing. Now, next. Yes, something that I think is very interesting about that example, and sorry again that you didn't really get to listen to it, is that the critical reception of this fake, say, or just AI-generated version of Beethoven received mixed acclaim. And there is that particular feedback from a violinist from the orchestra that I like, who said that it felt like Beethoven when playing it. However, it lacked the spirit of Beethoven. And I do think that it's very interesting to try to shift the perspective whenever one talks about music and artificial intelligence from, you know, all the questions that we're kind of like used to with regards to the creative process and composition, and shift the angle and the perspective to the actual cognitive effects and the reception and perception of music. How do people actually perceive it? Next. And so instead of asking a question such as, is AI as musically creative as human composers, I'd rather tackle questions such as, does AI music sound as good as human music to listeners? Can we distinguish between AI and human music? Those are very like standard questions, right? However, when I started thinking about that myself, and when I was playing around with all the platforms that are available to generate music, I started to realize a bias of mine, which is that I was assessing aesthetically and musically the quality of the piece, knowing that it was actually generated by AI. And so it just came to me, I started to think about how biased my judgment and my aesthetic experience, my musical experience was, given that I had that knowledge. And interestingly enough, next, a study came out about a month ago that maybe some of you have heard about, that is titled Humans Perceive AI-Generated Music as Less Expressive Than Comparable Human-Made Content by White and collaborators, which tackles exactly this very question, which is, how is it, or is it the case that knowing that something was AI generated affects the way you're going to perceive the music and the way you're going to enjoy it next? And so those are the main insights first. So when listeners are told that a particular piece of music is AI generated, they tend to rate the musical piece as less evocative and less emotional, yet equally enjoyable, which is interesting because it already says that they can tease those two things apart. But that's something that we know from the psychology of music. Another interesting finding was that they were mostly able to distinguish between AI and human music by relying on very fine-grained technical musical properties. So that's just a standard Turing test right there, right? Nothing new. But what this is saying is that we're not quite there because people can actually kind of tell. But the most interesting thing I thought next was this. So I'm quoting it from the paper. When forced to distinguish between excerpts from the same source, so either two AI-generated musical pieces or either two human-made musical pieces, participants projected more emotional qualities onto the music they labeled as human, even though it was generated by music, which I think is so fascinating, right? Fascinating. These findings suggest that beliefs about creative agency influence music perception and emotional engagement. So if you think that it was composed by AI music, you will tend to enjoy it less and to find it, for instance, less pleasant. Next. And so I think it's interesting to realize this. Sorry, I need to just get back on track right here as well. It seems like for the time being we have that inherent bias, right? This idea that people can kind of tell, and once you know that something has been, for instance, generated by AI, you can't really go back because you have that inherent kind of negative bias whenever you're going to assess the quality of the music. But I would like, just for the remaining 4 to 5 minutes, to think about a hypothetical near future, which is probably going to happen, in which we don't care that much anymore about whether music has actually been composed by AI or not. Also, in particular, because a lot of the music that is being produced as of today is already being using digital tools and AI-assisted dolls and stuff like that, right? So it's not something new. And I would just like to think about what the next steps should be once we kind of get rid and get away from the, oh, was it AI, wasn't it AI? And kind of move beyond those questions that are very standard and that we start to be kind of used to. And so I just wanted to ask the questions of what the further developments could bring research-wise to just the understanding of just music as an object, and also to music cognition and just the functioning of the human mind more generally. And so how could further developments benefit the state of the knowledge in music cognition next? One first thing which I would like to argue is that despite the very nice improvements that were made in, say, the few past years, in terms of reproducing singing voices, in terms of generating genre-specific patterns for composers to kind of broaden their repertoires, also to generate music from things that aren't linguistic, such as, for instance, pictures, I still do think, and it's something that is kind of going on, but I do think that this is the right direction to take, is to enrich and diversify the training data sets that those models are trained over. In particular, to include and incorporate more data that is not necessarily only musical and not only linguistic, such as labels for moods or any other characteristics of the music either. And for instance, I do think that it is interesting to train these models on data that also say something about the context in which music is being listened to. Why? Because if you can aggregate data about in which situations people actually do consume music, and you can pair that up with a set of properties of the music, then you can actually reveal very deep patterns about music consumption, right? And things that are just not as simple as the things that you find on current platforms. I'm thinking about Suno, for instance, the Suno platform that maybe some of you know, which uses prompting. You can select a few contexts or say a few functions for music in there. So you can for instance, choose something for training, you can choose something for your pet, you can choose something if you want something to chill or to go to sleep with, to go to bed with. But those are like very kind of like stereotypical categories and don't really say something about how human beings actually consume music. Another way of diversifying and enriching those training data sets, I think, would be to enrich them with multimodal inputs, which is something that is already being done, but which I think is very interesting to train models, not only on the music, but on the pairings that were made between music and, for instance, films or just any kind of visual messages, right? If you can collect a lot of data about what kind of music was chosen on top of what kind of particular scene, but also if you start using the data, for instance, that social media users use to illustrate a particular image or a particular video, then you gain a lot of knowledge in terms of the associations that people draw cross modalities, right? Across modalities. So you learn a lot about how music perception actually interacts with the rest of our cognitive lives. And one final suggestion that I wanted to make was that those models could also, at some point, incorporate neurological data from composers that would kind of like be equivalent to going back to that question of, oh, is it only AI? Can we get as far as we can in trying to imitate a creative process, which is not the point of my talk, but still something that could be done. In any case, I do like to see AI as a window into some kind of very fundamental research questions about music cognition, and more generally into the creative process next. And I would like to talk about the consequences of that. And of course, this is a bias of my own, right? Because I'm a researcher and I do music cognition and I'm interested in that. But I do think that for now, and this is not specific to music, right? The technical aspect of musical composition is kind of like shifting from, mastering musical knowledge and musical rules and just music theory to mastering, of course, prompting. That's something that is not new to any of you, of course. But what I've been observing myself is that, for instance, if I go back to the Suno example, what seems to be the case is that those AI models have a hard time processing information, technical constraints, right? So things with like musical terminology in terms of the bars, the rhythm, the melody, the harmony, and combining that with more, say, metaphorical descriptions, which is also something that we would like to be effective, right? You want to be able to say something about, I want a music that's going to represent a particular situation at that particular time of the day where something such as that happens that involves that particular kind of emotions. And I do not think that we're there yet, and you do see that quite easily when you practice with those tools today. And I do think that the reason for which that's the case, the reason for which AI models are still kind of struggling to combine technical constraints in music and descriptions, literal verbal descriptions of what the music should sound like, is because we are lacking knowledge in the psychology of music. And another way of saying it would be to say that we don't have very sophisticated models of music cognition, and we don't have very sophisticated models of music semantics yet. So it's kind of still a mystery how exactly music can trigger a lot of the mental representation that it triggers, right? We don't know exactly how pitch is mentally represented. We don't know what kind of things it makes you systematically imagine. We don't know a lot about those things. And so my take-home message, and I'm just going to disregard the final 2 points for reasons of time, and because I really do think that this is the central claim that I want to support, which is that I do think that the focus should be put on using AI to improve our understanding about music cognition and about the way the brain processes music. And once you have a nice model of how this is happening, of how music generates mental representations and triggers imagination, then only then can you develop AI tools that are going to generate music that is going to be faithful to those mental ideas, those musical ideas that you come up with. If you don't know already how that happens in the brain, then you're going to have a hard time trying to match a particular music with the idea that you have of what a composition should be. And yeah, I think that's going to be that for me. Thank you so much for your attention.